Right, hopefully you can all hear me and see me. We are going to try out this Q&A for the first time. We're actually now on a different camera, on a webcam. With the last minute adjustments I was just trying to figure out was all the lighting. Having the lighting on the forehead obviously was causing a little bit of glare, which was causing issues with the computer overheating. So we've changed some of the settings with the stream and things like that. So please just do tell us in the chat how that's working, if it's coming through okay, etc. So I will rely on you all to keep me informed there. So yes, so thank you very much, all of you. Where are we? For donating to the cause. It's the public response from people that I know and from people that I don't know has been kind of like overwhelming, and so really appreciate the financial support and also the just the logging on. I had like 134 people watching last night, which is a bit crazy. It just makes it kind of like worthwhile from a time perspective, because it has taken up a lot of time, which I've been very happy to do. But yeah, it's been a learning curve. But it's really interesting to learn some new things and do some new kind of new challenges, basically. And so we are figuring it all out as we go along, as we said before, and we'll just continue to do so. So the Q&A session is basically, a lot of people have sent in some questions in advance, and I have some notes on the iPad here and some pictures and things to sort of talk about. But we also will take questions in the in the chat. So if you are putting anything in the chat, then please do adhere to the chat rules, which are please put the preface of question in big writing, capital letters. In this case, anything is there is no topic. Okay, so any questions will be valid. I will try to answer them if they are kind of like appropriate. Some of those questions might be getting answered anyway. But yeah, so just put a question in there and we'll try and get around to it. Okay, I'm going to try and keep it to roughly about an hour. And if people's questions don't get answered, then maybe we'll do. Then there's the 9 PM session, or we could try and answer them kind of like privately. Oh, I got somebody's texting me in. Okay. I need got some pictures in. Okay, well, I'll get through those later, Grant. Okay, right. So, if you have written a question, let's just make sure we see who we've got here. Okay, Steve and Stuart have asked the same question. That's a big one, right? Carolyn. Okay, so Carolyn asked a question just very recently about getting backbudding on Ezo spruce. Now, one question I've got for you, Carolyn, is, although there is quite a big delay, so this isn't going to work. There's about a 30-second delay between me speaking and then stuff coming up in the chat. Ezo spruce in the UK it's quite difficult to get them to backbud normally, even in Japan. Backbud onto really kind of like old woods. So similar ideas to the Hinoki stream that we were talking about last night, where you do have those buds, you've really got to, further back in the tree. You really do have to look after them. So you can take some of the ideas and the concepts from the Hinoki stream, as in terms of you need the foliage at the branch tips to be strong and powerful in order to generate energy for the tree, which will generate buds on the inside and feed those buds on the inside. But equally, you don't want to have them the energy that's there too strong, or the foliage that's at the branch tips to be too strong, too dominant, and to stop those buds that you do have on the inside from growing. So it sounds like, because you said your tree was getting quite leggy. So what it sounds like is that you've really got to protect whatever inner buds you have on going there. So think about the light that can penetrate through to any inner buds that you have there, and think about encouraging those to come up from the inside outwards. So making sure they've got enough light. Airflow is a very important thing for spruce as well, and making sure it doesn't get too too kind of like fungally inside. You get a decent kind of airflow, because spruce are in normally in quite windy type environments, and so having that airflow, if they're stuck in cramped sort of situation where you're not getting airflow through the foliage, that can hurt them. And also humidity. Humidity is a important part for spruce. But really, what I would be looking at doing in order to generate and to assist those back buds is feeding it well, allowing those extensions to go out, okay, and then coming in and cutting back quite hard. We will get onto those extending species, so things like spruce. But I personally don't have a whole lot of luck with spruce in my garden, because of those airflow issues. Particularly, I think the air quality of air, the quality of the air down here where we are isn't as good as, say, up at Willowbog Bonsai up in Northumbria, where it's got a lot of air sort of going through, a lot of wind going through the garden, and there's a lot of humidity there, hence the name bog. And the spruce do really well up there. There's forestry plantations of Sitka spruce particularly up there, and they all just thrive because of that environment. They don't tend to do as well in large urban environments, and so like in Japan, for example, it's almost impossible to grow them very well in Tokyo, for various different reasons, but that humidity and the airflow is one of them. So what we will do is look at some of those, particularly like with taxes, things like that. But basically, you'd be looking at growing them out, building up that head of steam, and then cutting back. So similar ideas to the pine that we looked at, in terms of allowing that with the single flush growth, allowing that growth to come out, and then at the end of the year coming in, cutting it back to force that back budding. Similar type of idea, but with the spruce. With pine, you can basically cut back to just foliage and cross your fingers and it'll be all okay. With spruce, if it's particularly a weak tree, then you'd be wanting to cut back where there is a definite kind of like an obvious bud, really. I think definitely in the UK. So if you want any more sort of specific advice, then just take some pictures and pop in them an email. Okay, I hope that's answered that one. But there are, actually, one of the things I was going to say, there are a few different varieties of Ezo spruce. Realistically, there will be one of two. It'll either be kind of like the standard one, or it will be the Yatsubusa variety, which is like the miniature variety, like real compact growth habit. Essentially, they both behave the same. The Yatsubusa has much sort of denser, tighter needles, but and that tends to backbud a little bit more. A little bit better than the sort of the normal ones. So it does depend a little bit on the varieties. So okay, hope we answered that one. Right. We have a question from Dave Hanna. Okay, question. Hi, misting foliage on conifers, is it beneficial in warm weather? It is 28 degrees today, bright sun. Did you mist in Japan? Yes, misting is beneficial for basically cooling down the air temperature. So mentioned it last night with the hinokis and things like that. They evaporate moisture from their foliage in order to cool themselves down. So they basically cooling the leaves down through that. Putting moisture into the atmosphere. That's what it's doing. Okay, so it's taking moisture from the roots, taking it up through the tree, absorbing heat as it goes, and then through the process of evaporation, it takes that heat with it, and then the temperature drops. And so putting any cool water in the atmosphere will definitely help to reduce the overall temperature down. And it will help to reduce the rate of transpiration, so the tree doesn't need to do it as much. Okay, about 28 degrees, I would say, unless it's a weakened tree, I wouldn't really be too worried about it. It's once you start getting above 32, 33 degrees, and it starts getting a little bit hotter than that, then I would definitely start thinking about misting. Things that have been freshly repotted or are the root system is compromised in a little way, maybe a little bit damaged, then definitely, because it doesn't have that same ability to transport as much moisture up. So definitely think about that at the moment. So a lot of the trees that went through quite severe repot, conifers, and a couple of deciduous I put in there just to see if that made any difference. I've gone into like a humidity tent, so I've got a plastic tent I've made so inside the polytunnel there is a separate tunnel, and I have a little humidifier in there, so I just keep putting water in it. Just keeps the atmosphere completely like 100% humidity all the time, so there's a lot of moisture in there. And at the moment there's a spruce that underwent quite a severe repot. Again, spruce really enjoy that humidity, and also the severity of the repot. Maybe you just want to put it in there because it's not able to supply enough moisture to the needles, to the foliage. So particularly if we have a dramatic increase in temperature, and you'd be surprised to know, Dave, that it's been quite hot and sunny over here for the last couple of weeks. Some junipers are in there as well and things like that at the moment, so things that would benefit from that because their root systems have been compromised. But normally, like things outside, I wouldn't be misting them just as a matter of practice, because the problem that you can have when you are misting is fungal issues. And there is a question that both Steve Hale and Stuart Beresford have asked about cedar apple rust, which will involve this. But basically, fungal spores get transported airborne, and the having a lot of moisture in the air basically just increases the effectiveness of those spores. They stick to the needles. They get into the foliage a lot more easily as a result of having a lot of misting. So misting has its benefits and it also has its drawbacks. So you just have to, for some trees, you take that risk. Okay, root compromised. I'm going to mist the foliage, but I'm going to try and do it as little as possible because I don't want to end up with fungal issues. So it's a balancing act, but I wouldn't really be doing it like massively until, as I say, your temperatures are getting above 34, 35 degrees and such like. So the only things that we regular misted in Japan were azaleas, particularly after they've been cut back really, really hard. Okay, I got a couple questions about fertilizers. We'll try and answer all those together. So we'll go on to one of the questions. Brian, is Brian Carrick here? Give us a shout if you are, Brian, in the chat. If not, let's go to. Let's just talk. Well, let's just take on and go on to talking about the cedar apple rust, because both Steve Hale and Stuart Beresford have had sort of similar issues, and interestingly enough, they're both in similar parts of the world. So cedar apple rust. I'll just go through the question that Steve sent in. I have a small issue with cedar apple rust. Orange blobs have come up on branches. And so one of the symptoms of it's a fungal disease of this rust is the jelly-like blobs forming on the branches and of junipers, particularly out towards the tips, and sometimes you will get it coming from trunks and things like that. And let's go back to what Steve says. Okay, so they've come up on two junipers following the rain. So around about this time, so early spring, particularly when it's wet, humid, and hot, we tend to sort of start to see the evidence of these things coming out. So these jelly-like substance coming from the branches, and it came out on Chinensis and a Sabina, so two different varieties of juniper. Okay, the Sabina is tiny and on a sub branch which I've just cut off and got rid of. The Chinensis is a small patch but on the main upper trunk. Cutting it off would pretty much destroy the appearance of the tree. Okay, so the history of this issue. 2 years ago I spotted some patchy leaves on a hawthorn. Okay, this is important. Owned for 25 years with no previous issues. I cut them off. Okay, so that is one of the key things when you start to have this fungal disease. Okay, so cedar apple rust. We call it cedar apple rust, but there's cedar hawthorn rust. There's quite a few different rusts available on the market, and it basically jumps from hawthorn or apple tree to juniper, and then from juniper to hawthorn or apple. Okay, you couldn't see where my hand was going there, but it never jumps from juniper to juniper or from apple to apple. It requires that transition. Okay, so it's a two species or two family fungal disease. Okay, so it takes a couple of years to kind of go through the cycle. And the evidence is, let's go to this. This might be a little bit of a weird thing here. Okay, you're going to see this is going to look like we're looking through 1,000 mirrors. Okay, but here we go. Right. Hopefully you can hear me. Yep. Okay, so this is the two kind of sort of types of thing that you will see. This is a picture I just scabbed off the internet earlier this morning. But there's these yellow, the orange, jelly-like galls. This is definitely like the cedar apple rust, and you would see this on eastern red cedars in the United States quite frequently. The ones that we tend to see over in the UK are much more like a jelly-like substance, but you will get these kind of like tendrils that grow out, and on the end they're the spores that then get thrown out into the wind, and they go out and they find a hawthorn or an apple to infest. Okay, so round about this time of year is when it's happening. Okay, so these jellies form, send out their spores, and they go and start to infest the hawthorns or apples, and then you start to see leaves, kind of like patches on the leaves, discoloration and things like that. Basically dirty, scabby looking leaves. Okay, there we go, back there. And whenever you see those leaves, you've got to cut them off. Okay, so cutting off the jellies. When Steve saw that jelly forming, getting rid of it as soon as possible. Cutting off those leaves as soon as possible will help to stop the spread of this going further. And so one of the main attack methods for keeping and maintaining trees that have this disease, because it's impossible to kind of like get rid of once trees have it. Okay, but with the junipers, it does much less damage to junipers than it does to hawthorns and apples. Okay, for hawthorns and apples it can be a lot worse, but for the junipers, it's not as fatal. Okay, what you will tend to see is a general kind of weakening of the tree because it starts to affect the branch tips. The younger branch tips is generally where it starts to come out from, and so you will see a drop in vigour, a drop in energy production, and so one of the ways around that with the junipers is just basically to feed it more, to let it grow more, to rather than being quite aggressive with the pruning, as you would do on a healthier tree. You just kind of like let it have slightly larger photosynthetic surface area, so you're giving it more foliage to grow, and then just kind of like pushing it through the disease. Okay, so it's kind of like living with cancer, essentially. Some people can do it as long as the cancer isn't too strong and takes over the entire body. It's a bit of a crass analogy, but it can the junipers can sort of live with it, whereas the hawthorns and the apple trees, particularly in the wild, it kind of spreads through them terribly, and it can kill them quite easily. So it is quite a serious issue for apple growers, commercial farmers and such like. For us as bonsai practitioners, what we can do is definitely by cutting off all of those dirty leaves, is one way of trying to restrict the cycle of it. Okay, so proper hygiene is key to stopping the spread of any type of fungal disease, be it cedar apple rust, needle cast, fungal diseases that you get with trident maples, where in the spring you tend to see the leaves, they come out and they're all crunched up and they've got like sort of black tips. That can either be a fungal disease or it can be environmental sort of climate damage. So if the leaves are coming out and again it gets frosted. But really the biggest thing to do with that is you've got to try and make sure that those spores that are around don't then get transferred elsewhere. So the minute you start to see those jellies coming out, you're cleaning them off, disposing of them, sterilising your tools. Okay, and then also during this period of the year, you're keeping them completely apart. Okay, so you have your hawthorns as far away from you as possible, and from the junipers as possible. Okay, so it's about trying to break the cycle of spreading the disease rather than trying to cure it, because it's almost impossible to get to it is impossible to cure once it's kind of inside the tree. It's there. So cutting the upper trunk from the chinensis is not a way forward either, because it'll be in other parts of the tree and it can then come up through other parts. You've either got to burn the entire tree or just live with it and grow it through. It's definitely possible to live with it. You've just got to kind of think about the energy level, and it's the same there. Stuart's point was pretty much very similar, but he was talking about with a Sabina. He removed the infected branches and tried to treat copper fungicide. It's back this year over a lot of the tree. It's never grown that strongly over the 8 years that you've had it. I would say that could partially be due to the rust, but also due to other factors. The only way to make a juniper grow is to have lots and lots of foliage on it. So making sure that you've got as much foliage, just letting it grow and grow and grow and grow, just grow through the disease as much as possible is one way of doing it. But if it's a really weak tree and it's really heavily infected, then the bonfire could be, sadly, the best way forward for you, particularly if you've got a lot of those other species in there. In terms of control, you need to be controlling chemically at the time of year when the spores are active. So when those jellies are coming out, you can be prophylactically spraying your hawthorns as much as during that time. As basically hawthorns and apples, when the leaves are very soft, so about 3-4 weeks ago, when the leaves are soft, they're just coming out. That's when they're soft and susceptible to being infected. Okay, so the jelly comes out in early spring. The spores come out immediately and they infect the trees immediately. So spraying with a lot of those fungicides and things later on in the year isn't really going to help you too much. The only times it's worth spraying are when the spores are kind of like active, which is as the jellies are coming out, and then later on in the year, once those on the hawthorns and apples, the spores are starting to form, which you see these growths happening on the leaves, and then the hawthorns and the apples are sending their spores out to go and infect the junipers. So it's a bit of a long-winded kind of like way of just basically saying, if it's not too bad on your junipers, clean it out as much as possible, keep them separate, feed them very, very well, keeping them as separate as you can from any of your apple hawthorn species would be a way forward. If it's a really bad tree, then just think of the time that it's going to take to get a tree sort of really healthy and up and running and things like that, and it might just be better to kind of like give in. The other thing that's important with things like this is looking at what's happening around you in the wild, because if you have a neighbour's tree or trees in the wild, you live next to a forest that are just absolutely riddled with cedar apple rust, then it's gonna struggle. You're gonna struggle to ever kind of get control of it. Living in relatively urban environments is a benefit and also it can be very detrimental, because there isn't the same kind of like necessarily sort of as many natural predators around with pests and diseases. and you can often see there's also like an introduction of a lot of foreign species, in gardens and things like that, and so there can be a lot of material brought into like neighbouring gardens, or even gardens a quarter of a mile away, that have been infected. Okay, it's a big problem in the Netherlands, Belgium, and places like that, where there's a big nursery industry. This thing, it's just everywhere, and it spreads and spreads and spreads. So people in those areas do often have issues with this. One of the key things for any kind of pests and diseases, and somebody I think has mentioned this with actually it was here, wasn't it? Who was it? Alex. He was talking about roots, but anyway, realistically, one of the most important things to do is to make sure you have healthy soil, healthy organic environment within the soil, and then the tree will be able to cope with the natural stresses of insect attack and diseases to a certain extent, and it will also be able to kind of recover from it. So feeding the trees very, very well, those the junipers and sabinas that are affected, making sure that they're on a really good organic regime will be one of the best ways forward. Okay, so I hope that's answered your questions. It's a bit convoluted, and there's a lot of different sort of side aspects to that, but there we go. Right, so let's go back to the Q&A here. Simon Brown, I seem to be the Grim Reaper of Thuja. Any I touch seem to die. I have 4. They're all browning badly after pruning. What can I do better? What am I doing wrong? There was a live stream on Bonsai Mirai, so sign up to that. Watch that live stream, I would say. Don't touch Thuja very much over here. So the sort of the cedars, that they have a lot of it in America, but basically very sort of similar to the approach to Hinoki, I would say, is how I've always approached them. But yeah, definitely there was a live stream on Bonsai Mirai about that. So if you subscribe to that, then do so. Mark Cooper, spruce seem fine in South Wales. Yes, nice humidity. Your garden is relatively open, decent kind of airflow through there, so they do it okay. And also you water and fertilise organic. You water very well, you fertilise organically, and so you have good growth on them. Okay. Right, so Tom Buchanan asked, for occasional liquid supplements like seaweed and the fish stuff, would you be concerned at all about it being washed away through the pot during heavy rain like this week? Yes, I suppose you would. So if you applied it in like this morning and you had a massive heavy period of rain, then yeah, it probably would. Some of it would get washed out and leached out. But realistically, if you've got if you apply it in kind of like one of the, so in the fertilizer stream, I mentioned about trying to apply it to the soil when it's just beginning to become dry. So just as the Akadama is starting to change colour and start to look a little bit drier, if you apply it then, without letting the soil dry out to the point where the roots are going to be compromised, or the tips are going to die off because there isn't enough moisture, but just ever so slightly on the dry side, when you think, oh, I need to water that, that's the time to apply, the best sort of time to apply that liquid fertilizer, because it then gets sucked up into all of the pores of both the Akadama, pomace, and whatever components you have in there. It's going to stick to the surfaces, because they're there to be there's spaces for them to go to. So that's one aspect of the application. And then where we have a lot of heavy rain, it's the fertilizer that is sticking to the Akadama and to the other sites where the fertilizer can stick to, because it's very difficult for it to stick to some things. It will get leached out through heavy rain, okay, and all of those elements will be, they get taken out as the water passes through. So if you have prolonged periods of heavy rain, then the effectiveness of fertilizer can be reduced, because it is essentially kind of getting washed out, is the long and the short of it. So yeah, do try and apply before when we've got a period of relative dryness, which can be a bit difficult. Although, as I said, it's been relatively dry for us recently. So going on from that to Wesley's question about when using the fish hydrolysate or fish emulsion or any kind of liquid fertilizer, where we're actually it's sort of bit not sort of nitrogenous. Are you using it throughout the whole growing season or just the early part of the year? I would be using it, and I had this question, had this sort of conversation with some people on WhatsApp earlier today. Be using it throughout essentially the whole growing season, because what it does is it helps to keep the beneficial bacteria, particularly in the soil, healthy and happy. Okay, and so you want a good sort of, for most trees, for all trees, you want a good kind of constant level of activity in the soil, because it enables the tree to be healthy. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be super vigorous and push lots of growth, but what it does mean is it will be healthy. So having a little bit of the fish hydrolyzer or fish emulsion going into the soil will help that to happen. For trees that you're looking to push growth much more, then I would be fertilizing it with that a little bit more heavily and a little bit more frequently. Okay, so there's kind of like two levels of application. There's just the base level for everything, and then there is the higher level of things of fertilizing for really pushing. And that kind of higher level would be just really during the growing season, so between say 1st of April and the 1st of July. Second, like that sort of period where things are actively sort of pushing themselves out and extending off. Once we get past that sort of July period, things aren't really going to be extending as much, and things are then thinking about hardening off, and so different processes are happening within the tree. But that kind of like that base layer of just keeping the soil healthy would be essentially sort of throughout the year. Okay, so I hope that answers that one. Jan, I hope that question got answered. Right. So Jay Cornish Bonsai said, I think spruce really like cold winters to go fully dormant. Southern England barely froze this last winter. So yes, Ezo spruce. The name clue is in the name. So Ezo is basically Hokkaido, which is the upper island of Japan, and they're up even further up from that. And it gets very cold there. And Ezo do like to be, or all spruce, the cold weather trees, they do like to be covered in snow during the winter and to go dormant. Part of the reason for that is that requirement for dormancy, but part of it is also that they are very susceptible to damage from cold north winds and such like. So when the tree is not as active, if there is strong winds coming through, so we talked about the importance of wind during the summer in order to for that airflow to sort of go through. The opposite is true for the winter, and so they need to be kind of like covered with snow during the winter when they're not when there's not as much moisture transport coming up from the roots through the needles. So that winter dormancy, that covering of snow is an important thing. So if in the UK we have winters that aren't really cold enough, we very rarely do we get like any heavy snow and things, and quite often when we do, I'll actually go out, if there's any snow around, I'll sort of taking the snow and putting it on top of pines, putting it on spruce if I have them, in order to kind of get them cold and covered. Right. Okay, so Damien. Wanting to thicken the trunk of my Cotoneaster, should I leave trimming the shoots until later on in the year? So thickening the trunk on... So it's basically, in order to thicken anything, you need to have more foliage on it. There needs to be more activity. And there are different ways of achieving that. So things like maples, a lot of the deciduous species, and pines to a lot of the trees actually. Basically, just allowing the quickest way to develop a lot of foliage is just to allow one very strong shoot to grow and develop. Okay, just one shoot to go out and push. Okay, with Cotoneaster, that's not really going to happen quite so much. Okay, and also things like Zelkova. It's not going to happen. You will quite often get a lot more foliage developing if you allow it to grow out and cut it back. When you're pushing it hard with fertilizer, allow it to grow out a little bit, cut it back, and then it's going to ramify. And it's going to keep sending out shoots. So like shrubby type growth, of which Cotoneaster is, actually kind of not allowing it to extend off too much and coming in and kind of like cutting it back. That hedge pruning technique is where you will actually get a lot more kind of like thickening relatively quickly. So for a lot of the species, in order to thicken up branches and trunks, for at least a year or two, allowing one single shoot to go out is a very good way of doing it. With Cotoneaster, all you're going to get is you're going to get one thin, long, little sort of shoot that comes out with tiny little leaves on it, generally, and if you allow that by say the end of the year, you maybe have 20 leaves on that one long shoot. Excuse me. If you kind of allow it to grow out a little bit, pinch the tip, maybe cut it back a bit, it's going to keep growing and keep growing, and that way you can maybe get 60 or 70 leaves on it by the end of the year. Okay, and that's how you're going to get the thickening. So I think with Cotoneaster, I'd be looking at a bit more of a hedge pruning sort of technique in order to develop the thickness. What you do need to do is just bear in mind like the thickness of the branches and things like that, because if you are doing that, quite often what you will end up with is branches that don't have as much taper. Okay, so they'll be kind of like the same thickness at the base and the same thickness at the end. And with Cotoneaster, it's not as because of their growth habit. They're not as, you're not going to get the same results as you will do with say Japanese maples or trident maples, beech and things like that. So slightly different. Okay, Brian is here. Good. So yeah, I hope that answers the question though. It depends. Okay, what I would do is a bit more of a hedge pruning technique they're doing. Right, so Brian is here. Okay. So Brian is in northwest France, and he asked a question, or he mentioned something. Jeff Banning also mentioned a very sort of similar question. So Brian sent an email saying, out here in France, a video was posted on the grazing technique on a beech. I cut off all leaves bar one or two before they extend. Now everybody's doing it. This is completely the opposite to what you did the other night. I fully understand your principles of energy management and are going with it. The question is, who will have the most backbudding at the end of the year, and what are long-term consequences? And Jeff Banning, who's up in Scotland, in Ayr, sorry to come back to this, but on my beech are just starting to break and I'm wondering about bud pinching. In the last session, it seemed like you waited and pinched out new shoots, but do not get the bud from inside its cigar. I saw an article on this in Bonsai Focus some time ago, but I'm not sure that I'm doing it right. Okay, I did answer Brian in email. I didn't answer Jeff because we're going to talk about it here. But basically, there are lots of different techniques that you can apply to bonsai, and they are, for the most part, need to be tailored and specific to your individual circumstances. A lot of the principles are very much the same. So, for example, I don't know if you have seen the video on that Bjorn Bjorholm was made about pruning of single flush pines. So I did a stream on single flush pines. We had these candles that are about this long, and I'm coming in and pinching them. The video that Bjorn made, if you haven't seen it, go over and watch it on his YouTube channel. He's got these massive long extensions like this, and he's coming in and cutting them off. Okay. Essentially, we're both doing the same thing. Okay, we're both controlling the length of what the extension in the spring is going to be doing. It's just where he is in Tennessee, where it's massively hot and the incredibly intense sunlight. Okay, very very sort of similar to Japan. He gets that type of growth in the spring. Okay, so he can wait until it's extended out massively. Okay, before going in and doing it. Okay, it's going to take us 2 years to get that type of extension where we are, and so we're operating different levels of energy within the tree because of different levels of sunlight intensity. I mentioned this in the the stream about energy, okay, and energy management within bonsai. Because we are operating in that type of environment, we have to be much more careful with how we deal with the energy, okay, and not wasting it. Okay, so there was in one of the videos, a couple of the videos, there's, you know, always make sure you kind of like got an idea of how much you've kind of like cut off, okay, and with the pine, the candle pinching thing, got all of that, all of those little tips that got pinched off. All of that's basically wasted energy. So when you're cutting, like yesterday with the hinoki streams and things like that, having a good clear idea of how much you've cut off is a good idea of like how much energy's been wasted, how much foliage or energy producing capability has been removed from a tree, as was the example with the hinokis last night. And when you're in lower energy situations, then wasting less is important. When you're in energy lower situations in terms of like the amount of sunlight that you're going to get, making sure you have more foliage is a benefit. Okay, and so for people who, like in the example that Brian gave of video in France, people going in and pinching immediately, that would work if it's in the south of France, you know, down in Montpellier, down in areas where it's a lot hotter, where there's a lot more sunlight. Okay, that technique could work brilliantly. Okay, but for me here, and for a lot of people in the UK, certainly, I've had after the beach stream, a couple of people contacted me and said that they've been using that Japanese technique of going in and opening it out and pinching that tip, and had terrible results. Okay, so they were going to try doing what I said. So it's about tailoring the concepts and the ideas to your own specific situations. I will do, and I did do on that slanting style beach, I did go in as things were opening up and pinched out on a few certain areas, those really strong areas where I was really looking to hold things back. For the rest of the tree, just allowing things to extend out, and I will go in and I will stop each individual branch when I think it is balanced, when I think the energy, the amount of foliage on it that's coming out is going to be sufficient for that area of the tree. I'll go in and pinch it out. So really, you've just got to think about your own individual situations. Think about the tree that's in front of you. Think about all the things that you can control, and try and make the best judgment calls on what technique to apply and how aggressively and when. And this is where bonsai starts to become difficult. Okay, the techniques that we use are really very simple. Go in, stop the candle, it's fine. When you do it, and for what reason that you do it, that's where it starts becoming very difficult and case by case situation. So all I'm trying to do here is arm you with some of that knowledge and some of those ideas and concepts as it applies to me and my bonsai practice in my little corner of England. Okay, for people in Northern Ireland, for people in Southern Ireland, for people up in Scotland, for people in northwest France, it's going to be different. Okay, similar but different. Okay, so just try and just think about those ideas when you are looking to apply the techniques. Okay, right. So we will go back to the Q&A bit. Dave Gladwin, question: the juiced up Biogold, is it used straight out of the bottle or is it diluted? It depends on how many pieces you put in. So my example that I did, I put in like 25-35 pieces into 2 litres, in which case I would dilute that once it comes out. If you do it according to the instructions on the pack, which I don't have one to hand, which is 2 or 3 pieces per litre, then you just use it straight. Okay, so it depends how concentrated you make it initially. So I'm going to answer that question. Right, question. There's a question right at the start of the chat which you may not have seen. Okay, Matt. Any refinement advice for Acer campestre? I trialled early this year, pinching the emerging buds and got very short internodes. Now starting to fertilise to support a possible second flush. Oh, and I missed a question from Will. Sorry, there we go. Right, so Acer campestre, field maple, very sort of super coarse variety of maple, and so it's all about staying on top of the growth and not pushing too much. Okay, so if you want short internodes, it's about going in there and pinching really quickly, which you've done. So that's step one of the first steps. Another step is to not fertilise too heavily. Okay, they don't need a whole lot of fertilizer. They're just super efficient at growing in the UK climate, which is why they're found everywhere. You don't even want to be pushing it too much, even with that sort of second flush of growth. Yeah, it's just about staying on top of it. The only people I've known who have had really good success with field maples are those people who are just on it all the time. Just as things are coming out, pinch, pinch, pinch. So you said you started to fertilise to support a second possible flush. You can defoliate them, which is the active destruction of leaves, of energy producing, in order to regulate the vigor and the amount of energy that's within the tree. We will get onto that in due course, but really, yeah, it's just about trying to restrict the tree's ability to grow if you want a refined field maple. The other thing that you can do to think about in that sense is the frequency or the lack, or making sure that the time between repottings is perhaps left a little bit longer. So if you're doing it every 2 years, maybe leave it to 3. Try and push it to 4, because that will then sort of slow down the development of the roots, and it will also sort of slow down the development of the top of the tree. Okay, but the more that you're doing that, it's very similar to the idea of the Literitis Scots pine sort of showing. You then start pushing it towards the knife edge of it being very, very difficult to, or making it a lot easier to make a mistake. Okay, one of the few people I've ever seen make some really beautiful little field maples was Ian Bailey. A lot of people think of him as being just a potter up in Scotland, but he made some phenomenal little field maple trees, which were just incredible. So if you want to know about that, get in contact with him, because he definitely knows a lot more than I am. Right, sorry, Will. Forgot I didn't see your first question there. How to deal with single flush pines that continue to extend the unneedled naked part of the candle after pinching, destroys the shortened internode length I'm looking for. You're basically ending up with a sort of similar situation there as you would do with trees that flower a lot. So essentially what happens, and we're not going to be hopefully mirrored now. Oh dear, there's a neighbour shouting his dog. Are we going to be mirrored? Where we have the needles here, flowers. Yeah, we're okay, because we're not in selfie mode like we were last time. So this is like a white pine or a Scots pine that flowers heavily at the base and then extends out. So then that would be last year's needles, flowers, and then what will become this year's needles. Okay, and so when you end up with a situation that once the flowers finish, we end up with this bare stem. And what Will is saying is that even without it flowering, he's still getting this bare stem. Okay. Essentially, when that happens, what you have to do is just try and push growth as much as possible. Try and get the needles as long as possible and as healthy as possible, and then late July, early August, come in and cut back. It's the only way to kind of get rid of that stem. Okay. So if you've already pinched, then all I would do is push it, try and fertilise it as much as possible. Okay, and try and get those needles to be as long as possible. Fertilising it a lot and making it healthy, you might then start to see adventitious bud formation coming in here. Okay, particularly if it's a Scots pine. You didn't specify which pine it was, so there is a bit of a sort of difference there. The differences between all the different species and things like that. But if it was a Scots pine or the Miyajima white pine, then this is what I would be doing. But yeah, just try to push it as much as possible, and then coming in and cutting back where you can. Okay, yeah, I don't want that either. Okay. Again, it's a judgment call on whether you do it or not. But basically, there has to be a surplus of energy within the tree. Okay, so you've got to have that surplus. If you feel there's a surplus of energy, once you get to that late July, early August sort of type period when it's starting to redistribute the energy and you feel confident enough to come in and cut back, then do so. If not, wait. If the tree is like super healthy and gangbusters vigorous, you could even okay, let's not do that. Wait another year and do it at the end of next year and come in and cut back all the way down to there, as long as there's decent needles in it. That starts getting very, very risky. Okay, but basically, in order to get that back budding, we have to have vigor. Okay, so it's not the end of the world if you do get your bare stem on there. But yeah, just try and look to cut back in late July, August, I would say. Again, if for the specifics, come in and maybe send a picture or whatever. Be all a lot easier. Okay, right. Let's just see if we have any other questions of people in here. I think they'll all be this evening's. Another one of Jeff's questions because he's here. Okay, so Jeff sent a load of questions in, so we'll try and answer a few of those as well. The one about developing taper on new branches, we'll talk about that tonight, so if you can't make it, then just watch the repeat. Cedar. I have a blue Atlas cedar, and like many, is lacking lower branches. How does approach grafting work on this type? Is it worth a try? No idea. I would assume it will graft, because you do get a lot of grafted garden varieties and things like that, so you could have a go. Or alternatively, look at starting the tree without any lower branches. It depends on how far up the tree the branches start coming out of. Okay, so as long as they're not, you've got branches like the first branches coming out about 2/3 of the way up the trunk. Once you start getting above that, like 2/3 kind of height, then it starting to look a little bit weird in terms of the ratio of height to branches and things like that. So as long as it's not like that much higher up than that, then you could still style a tree, I'm sure. But cedar and they are a difficult species to do with bonsai because of a lot of their growth habit characteristics. So just potentially change the way in which you look at the tree. Try not to compare it to Scots pines or junipers and things like that. But yeah, maybe just look at how you could style it without grafting the branches down there. But if it is absolutely terrible, then yeah, just have a go at doing a graft. If anybody out there has done it, then send in success stories or terrible. Okay, right, just one more question from that. Which one will be good? Different. So, okay, hawthorn. Okay, so Jeff has a Paul Scarlet variety, which is grown on grafted stock, so different root stock. So this is something similar to what we talked about last night. The Monogina root stock, I understand. Yep, basically something which is more vigorous. Is an air layer on the Paul Scarlet section of trunk likely to be successful, or are they difficult to root from their own trunks? Okay, so this is going back to one of the things we talked about last night in the Hinoki stream. For garden variety trees, or garden centre trees, trees that are designed for a different purpose, they choose the way in which they're going to get the most vigorous results, the strongest results, and to remove any potential weaknesses from genetic weaknesses from something which is very attractive. So the Paul Scarlet variety of hawthorn, these beautiful double red flowers, very lovely looking flowers, but they're not quite as vigorous on their own roots as the normal hawthorns are, and so that's why they're grafted. So there's a good reason for that. It promotes strong, healthy growth. It could potentially be things about disease resistance, etc. And so once you start to sort of take it off of those, the grafted roots, things like that, then you would definitely lose some of those benefits. There are certain species like Shishigashira, for example. Shishigashira are very often, like with the maples, it's a bit less important because, for example, you will see things like Deshojo, Shishigashira, Benichidori, and all these kind of things, which are often grafted onto sort of standard Japanese maple rootstock, they will be strong enough on their own roots, so you can air layer them off, and they will be strong enough on their own roots, but they may not be as vigorous as they would be. But in a bonsai environment, that's not a problem. Okay, but in a garden environment, it would be. So, but with the hawthorn, it's grafted for a reason. I would stick with it. Particularly with the Paul Scarlet as well, you're not going to get that same beautiful kind of natural branching, because it has a different branching habit as well to hawthorn. Realistically, they're just kind of like flower trees. It's difficult to make them into something other than that because of their growth habit, I've found. And so just appreciate it for what it is, this beautiful flowering tree, rather than looking to try and make it into something that would compare up against like a Yamadori hawthorn. Okay. Right, so let's go back to the questions and things. Simon Brown: I live in a very windy part of the west of Ireland, had a lot of needle die off on my spruce over winter. Should I let it recover, or bud select pinch as normal? Let it recover. Sick trees, trees that have suffered any type of stress, and this is a question that Richard Westbroom also asked, sort of similar. He said, I have a beech that I've managed to avoid killing. Well done. We all have trees that we've managed to avoid killing. And it's currently in a plastic pot filled with sphagnum moss, set in a water tray whilst the roots recover. It started to leaf out, but when should it be repotted into a bonsai pot with bonsai soil? So basically a very sort of weakened tree, which is recovering. Simon's got the same thing, a weakened tree that's starting to recover. Think about the energy levels within the tree. Think about rejuvenating it and getting it back up to strength and up to health before you do anything else on it. Okay, any green is good green. Any green will photosynthesize, will put energy back into the system. Be it the beech which has suffered and needs to put on some roots, that needs any foliage in order to generate some new roots. Once you've got those new roots, then you can start thinking about what you can do with the branches and things like that. So that beech which has suffered, rewind 55 minutes to when we were talking about misting trees, or 50 odd minutes to when we were talking about misting trees that have been root compromised. So this beech tree needs to be kept somewhere where it's not going to be losing moisture from the foliage, so i.e. a polytunnel, a greenhouse, underneath a bench, out of the wind, so that there's no excess transpiration going on that the roots cannot supply enough moisture for, because the root's been compromised. So that needs to be looked after. Once it's got some roots, if it can end the year still alive, then you can start thinking about potentially transitioning it into bonsai soil. At which point you would do absolutely no cutting of the roots, but it could stay in sphagnum moss for 2 years, no problem at all. Peter Chan, one of his famous techniques for rejuvenating anything, is basically just putting it in sphagnum moss for 1 or 2 years. It's fine. Okay, for longer than that, it's not a good idea. So Simon, I would say just let it grow. Just let anything grow, and then start. Once you've got some foliage mass on it, some needle mass on it, then you can start thinking about what you do with it. Okay, right. This is going to be the final question, and then we'll call it a day, an afternoon. So Dan, I did have your question in here, but you've mentioned it there. Quince, how do you promote backbudding on a quince that has only new growth and vigour at the tips? You didn't specify if it was a Chinese quince, I don't think, or a garden type quince, but essentially they're the same thing. See you later, Matt. What you need to do is the same as with talking about creating backbudding on the hinoki, talking about creating backbudding on what were we talking about? Junipers. What were we talking about earlier? Pines. Allowing that, allowing it to extend out and then cutting back later on in the year. the video that we looked at. I'm just see if we can bring it up now. In the pine candle stream of pinching the candles, of not pinching the candles, allowing them to extend out till late July, early August, and then coming and cutting them back. Basically, what you're doing there is you're generating as much energy as possible within the growing season, making sure that within the system of the tree there's plenty of energy, and then when it comes time to be setting out back buds, cutting back hard, and then you'll start to see that. So essentially it's that same process. Okay, so with your quince, what you want to do is feed it well, push the growth at the tips, get it going, and then cut back as hard as you feel comfortable doing. So allow extensions to come out to 8, 9, 10 leaves, letting them come out, okay, photosynthesizing, regaining all the energy that they've used that they've spent on growing them themselves, and then got extra, okay, and then coming in and cutting back hard, and then you'll start to see back budding. Quince, if it's the garden variety quince or chojibai, for example, they want to send out sucker shoots. They want to send out new growth from the inside. Okay, if it's a Chinese quince, then it's similar but not quite as they won't send out sucker shoots like coming from the base, but they will back bud on old wood if super healthy. Okay, Chinese quince fertilize them very, very heavily. They really love lots of food, lots of water, lots of food, lots of water, lots of foliage. Feed them well, you can cut them back really hard and they will bud up. Okay, but it's all about getting that growth at the tips. You've got to get that happening. Got to have a lot of growth happening there first before you cut back. Pinching it out before it's had a chance to build up that head of steam, you're just going to end up with bare branches and stuff like that. Okay, right, so we've just gone over an hour. Japanese. Okay, so basically the same things apply. Okay, for that tree then, Dan, just let it grow for the first part of the year, and then if we do have workshops up on Winterbock in June, then bring it in. If not, then just send us some pictures of it June-ish time, and we'll make a sort of decision on sort of what to do there. But they will want to back bud naturally. Okay, right. So I think that went okay. We've improved the tech a little bit. I think this new camera, it has a bit of interaction with some of the lights, so you might have to see what it's like this evening, and such like. But yeah. I hope that was of benefit to everybody, and any feedback on how it worked will be good. This evening I'm going to go through a few more pictures, and there'll be a little bit more kind of like less just me sat here chatting. But yeah, if anybody has any sort of follow-up questions, you can pop in this evening. If not, just sort of get in touch. And we'll have another Q&A session at some point fairly soon, I would imagine. So yeah, thanks a lot, and thank you very much for as I said, for all your support and everything. Without you guys, wouldn't be doing it basically. So really do appreciate it. So yeah, might see you this evening. If not, probably on Sunday. I've got to go out tomorrow, and then so Sunday I'm not sure what we'll do. It might be quite a short live stream if we do it. Not going to do junipers, do that in a bit more detail probably next week. What was the thing I was thinking about? Oh, I forgot. Oh, larch. That was it, larch. Probably have a look at larch on Sunday, because I've got one or two that need a little bit of kind of like looking at and attention and could be talked about. So yeah, all that's left to say is this stream's been brought to you in association with a nice cup of Yorkshire tea. So good stuff. All right.